I guess we could call these morning pages. Morning pages, as you are probably aware, emerged from Julia Cameron's The Artist Way, a publishing phenomenon of the early 1990s, part of a wider self-help and creative recovery movement that treated everyday writing as a kind of secular devotion, a ritual to be performed before the world intruded, as one might say a prayer or stretch one's limbs before the day begins in earnest. The idea was that by beginning every morning with 3 longhand pages of uncensored thought, anyone, not just the so-called hallowed artists of this world, could reclaim a sense of agency, intuition, and quiet amid the noise of late-stage capitalism. Morning pages aren't being communicated to anyone. They are neither correspondence nor confession. They are more like a democratic liturgy, a private rite enacted in common solitude for all of us to, as Whitman put it in Song of Myself, sound our barbaric yawps over the roofs of the world.
And we're coming out of dreams. As we're coming back, yeah, we're coming out of dreams. As we're coming back, and we're coming out of dreams. As we're coming back to dreams.
To effuse our thoughts in eddies and let them drift in lacy jags, as if the act of writing itself were a means of staying human, of hearing one's own voice amidst all of this online din. I have tried morning pages in the past, but they always remind me of writing against the clock at a school exam, that anxious, proctored silence in which one's own thoughts seem both too loud as well as insufficient, as if the self writing those pages, suddenly summoned to declare itself, has actually very little to say. Allard talked about doing morning pages yesterday. He had cancelled his session last week on Tuesday and then dithered on the Thursday as to whether he might still want to have it, but then didn't, only providing me with the backstory of this toing and froing in our talk yesterday. In the days between, he had suffered what could only be described as a kind of THC-induced psychospiritual collapse, a bad trip, essentially, in which his inner coordinates were lost, the mind spinning loose from its own axis. For several hours he could say nothing but the same looping phrases. Am I good? Am I bad? Is this real? Is this a sign? As if moral confusion itself had become his sole language. The whole household had been thrown into disarray, his mother and sister hovering outside the bathroom door, then rushing in as he began to panic and hit himself. The family doctor summoned, a friend of his parents, who arrived like a small, calm deus ex machina with his sedatives and his gentle fatherly tone. Calls placed to A&E, the usual uncertainty about whether this counted as an emergency or a nightmare to be endured at home. For hours the woman circled him, soothing, restraining, pleading, until the drug began to loosen its grip and the familiar outlines of the world, of logos, of reason and recognition might return, fragile yet intact, like a language recovered after a long and perilous silence. After spelling all of this out, his psychological, mechanic, plumber and technician, which is to say me, then came in for some criticism, though the charges were delivered with that mix of diffidence and resolve peculiar to the wounded but still courteous type. Certain of my comments recently, he said, had jarred, one too sharp, another too lenient, a few altogether beside the point. He felt at moments unheard, at others overexposed, and worst of all, occasionally advised to turn to that other interlocutor, ChatGPT, that neutral yet inexhaustible intelligence to which I had indeed directed him once or twice when, nearing the end of the hour, he had asked for supplementary tools or strategies for an issue that he'd spent the whole hour not really talking about, and for which I had suggested GPT might offer immediate, if provisional help, which in fairness it did. His family, meanwhile, had grown sceptical of the entire enterprise, urging him towards a proper psychologist, someone face-to-face, HCPC as opposed to BACP credentialed, perhaps twice a week, as if the multiplication of hours and degrees might restore what they took to be missing: the authority, the guarantee, the illusion of a cure. I encouraged him to reassess whether he might indeed get more of what he required from a more structured, symptom-focused clinician, the kind who measures progress in charts and modules rather than digressions and moods, who calls egoic manifestations by their diagnostic terms and prescribes behavioral homework instead of existential questions to focus on and interrogate in the next week. Such a figure, HCPC credentialed and perhaps twice weekly, also no doubt twice or thrice my fee, might approach his crises as discrete, treatable problems. The panic episode as a stress cycle malfunction, the moral torment as cognitive distortion, the cannabis relapse as a behavioral lapse to be logged, analyzed, and prevented, stopped in its tracks. Whereas my way, if it can be called a way, has been slower, more circular, more inclined to dwell and double back, more given to reflection than repair, concerned less with control than with comprehension, with cultivating language and self-understanding rather than correcting error. But the new knight in shining armour, he wanders in our session, echoing the voices of his family and social media culture, might indeed offer him a treatment plan, which ironically is exactly where we began, with Aldi consistently as well as artfully ducking and dancing around the initial treatment plan like a man allergic to prescription, weary perhaps that too much structure might cure him of something he still believes he needs. I understand his sudden volte-face after the drug-induced wobble. The strung-out dude now thinks a treatment plan from an HCPC clinician is the way forward, a clinical person willing to do clinical things to him. I get it, I really do. For this reason, I won't mind being dismissed. I won't mind being dismissed at all if this is where we are heading. In a sense, being dismissed, being let go of, one person to the other, is the proper and inevitable ending of therapy, as well as pretty much every human relationship or connection as far as I can tell. Just as soon as the projection dissolves and the patient or friend or lover resolves that they no longer need your listening ear, your soul, in the way that they thought they might initially need it, they go. Or you go. No one stays loyal to another indefinitely. This is a quality of dogs, not of human beings. It's cardigan weather again. One of the pleasures of cardigans, at least the cardigans I like, is having those two woolen pockets that you can slip your hands into. They feel different from the pockets of jackets, which are often too shallow or too slanted, lined with either slippery satin or indifferent polyester. There's something very particular about resting your hands in cardigan pockets as you walk along, the light lift of the hands and forearms, the sense of the arms being carried or nestled rather than hanging, a bit like a swaddled child. Maybe that's part of the pleasure, that faint feeling of being swaddled, of being held, of being carried, instead of having always to carry oneself. What a mopey and miserable conduit for language you were yesterday, my friend. And how strange that even with the line, the channel, we might say, always open for you to now pour yourself into it, to what we might call the ear of God, which is to say the listening centre of necessity itself, you could find nothing better to offer that than your small and pathetic complaints about the insufficiency of your fairly comfortable life. Pathetic, yes, although I feel no pathos towards your domesticated animal condition, you being just one of many billions of pampered primates who can pass their entire existence without the fear of being eaten, whose food arrives without needing to hunt or even meaningfully work for it, whose safety is guaranteed by mechanisms so vast and indifferent we barely notice them. To say life is not good enough, even amazing enough, is simply to mean that it is not amazing in the way that our minds' advertisements once suggested it might be, that the utopia of convenience has failed to deliver transcendence. But what did we expect? Transcendence through plumbing and Wi-Fi? We are the first generation to live as gods and still feel forsaken. We are to be pitied as well as scorned. So today I thought, if I'm really speaking into that ear, not the ear of a being, for God is no being, but the ear of what must be, the ear of Ananke, the ear of necessity, then I should probably make better use of my hard-won access to this God. To speak into necessity itself and offer only one's discontent is not unlike whispering to the sea that one is thirsty. And yet, that is what we do, endlessly, confusing the noise of our own complaints for proof that someone, somewhere, must be listening. The Judeo-Christian tradition framed its God as a monarch who craved constant praise, but perhaps that was only an early attempt to render intelligible a deeper intuition, that existence itself demands a response, that to pray and eulogize God is to participate in the unfolding of what is. The mystics understood this long before theology did. Meister Eckhart, for instance, said that gratitude is the only proper posture before being, not gratitude to someone, but rather for isness itself. Spinoza called it amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God, by which he meant the joy of recognizing necessity and consenting to it. And yet, what does one do with this knowledge once it has been learned or half-learned, once the mind has looked directly at God, at necessity, and found no petition to make against it? Praise, in such a world, can no longer be song, but something quieter, a murmured assent to the machinery that keeps the stars in place and the lungs inflating each morning. Perhaps that is what those oft-quoted mystics were trying to say when they spoke of joy. Not delight, necessarily, but the momentary suspension of resistance, a fleeting truce between the self and the structure that built this self. To live, after all, is already to participate, whether one sings or not. The question is only whether one can bear to look at the whole and call it good, or scowling, turn away. On this question of goodness, a line from Ashish stuck in my mind after our conversation a few days ago. "I'm just waiting for something good to come my way," he said at one point. And yes, I get it, I got it. This young man hasn't had much good dealt to him of late by life, by God, by necessity, but therapy mode, of course, obliges more than just a nod. We are being paid, are we not, to wrap and sometimes unwrap the longing for all the good that does. Waiting for good shades quickly into waiting for Godot, I thought, although didn't say this. A Godot that will likely not arrive unless the self as creator, not God, but the creature with head, heart and instincts, begins to write or paint or garden, whatever it is other than mope. As a self-preservation 6 with a strong 1 and 3 fix, Ashish struggles to imagine bringing any good into his life other than getting a job. Not for the paycheck necessarily, he has money, but for status, structure and meaning, which of course is the only good our culture can recognize, the only good he and I can recognize when we're not mouthing self-help platitudes at each other in our sessions. Having been lightly castigated by Aldi the day before, I made a note to send Ashish some questions, practical, angled, clinical, we might even say, something like, 1. If something good did arrive this week, how would you recognize it within the first 10 minutes? What 3 observable signs would tell you it's here? And 2. What is one small good within your control, 15 to 30 minutes daily, that repeated for 7 days would measurably change your mood or logistics? That sort of thing. Psychotherapy, or at least the place where it began, was never meant to become what it has become, this odd, faintly comic, global enterprise of clinical smoke and mirrors. Apes in suits and ties with framed certificates on their walls, dispensing diagnoses as if they were prayers recited from the DSM. And then, of course, the behavioral injunctions given to client or patient, the equivalent of 3 Hail Marys, 4 Our Fathers, so as to get those wayward human souls, those sinning human souls, back in shape or back online. The original scene was much humbler than this, almost religious in its simplicity. A single, tormented person lying on a couch, staring at the ceiling, speaking to God. Well, to Freud, who liked to think of himself as the most secular of men, the thoroughly modern Jew, the assimilated Viennese rationalist, but a man who could not entirely, clearly, erase his rabbinical lineage. This inheritance remained in the posture, in the listening, in the conviction that language itself might heal. To do this, Freud rebranded the old relation, priest and penitent, shaman and supplicant, into analyst and analysand, but the current was the same. The therapist, like the priest, becomes the conduit through which another speaks to God, or to what remains of God, in a disenchanted age, the silence that answers back in human tones. The analysand confesses, interprets, implores, and the transference performs its miracle of misdirection. God is projected onto the one who listens, who is by turns a screen, a mirror, a phantom. You will sort me out, says the sufferer, praise the sufferer, you will make sense of me. But of course, what is really being addressed all along is the void, is Ananke, is God. Perhaps that is why the couch still feels holy, and why therapy, for all its science, remains a secular form of prayer, a long, looping monologue into the dark, in the hope that by speaking enough, one might one day hear something like an answer, or at least the echo of one's own voice becoming intelligible to itself. Much like I'm doing here, I guess. I don't know what you're thinking, God, but whatever it is, it's probably got nothing to do with me. Last night, Bhavesh and I were speaking about this, about how there are really only 3 stations, if one can call them that, in the life of a person who has replaced some essential relationship, whether with the world or with themselves, by that of a substance, his being alcohol, mine cannabis. Whenever I talk to Bhavesh about his drinking, usually on a Thursday evening, my own desire for ethanol increases, as if hearing of his intoxications were contagious. So much so that last night after our session, I was seized by the need to buy a bottle of white wine, ostensibly for the mushroom risotto I was making, although I ended up drinking more than half of it, a 13.5% Spanish Sauvignon Blanc Verdejo number, which didn't do me any favours the following day, even though all that lovely sugar alchemized into ethanol poison did give me a few hours of soft, woozy pleasure, an inadequate consolation in retrospect, but addicts of all stripes rarely take into account their retrospective wisdom. So, the 3 stations of the cross. The first we called run amok mode. For him, that would be a Saturday night with no limits, 12 or 13 pints perhaps, followed by some sort of ritual of contrition. He knows it is not ideal for his marriage, although, like many addicts who manage to remain in work and love, he insists that things are not so bad there, and by the sounds of it, they really aren't. Then there is sobriety, that shining or colourless star, depending on one's moral telescope. To some, it appears the pinnacle of virtue, to others, a kind of death by restraint, a life emptied of useful encumbrance. Addictions, I think you'll find, whatever their object, drink, cannabis, YouTube, sex, caffeine, self-loathing, do give shape to time, furnishing the day with a meticulous occupation, a private geometry of desire and control. Remove it, and life becomes amorphous for the addict, or so he fears, a sequence of dutiful gestures without contour or climax. And then, of course, there is the third mode, the one we both inhabit, that of management, the managed life, yes, of the craven, disgusting, piece-of-shit addict who no longer dares to run wild, but who cannot bear to live entirely clean. The manager must always be present, always calculating when to have the first drink, the first joint, whether to abstain tonight or relent after the children are in bed or after some imagined threshold of virtue has been crossed. It is an exhausting position, no doubt, this perpetual vigilance. Yet neither of us, I suspect, truly wants to be free of it. Management promises a form of equilibrium, even if that equilibrium depends upon a quiet daily deceit. Perhaps in time, after another dry January or some other moral experiment, we will come to the idea that only sobriety can reconcile body and soul, our chemistry and our conscience. But for now, both of us live here in the liminal space between control and collapse, where the mind plays manager and the flesh plays God. Addiction, they say, is a spiritual crisis, and I do not disagree with this. One enters it, or it enters one, as both refuge and rebellion, a way of stepping aside from the intolerable brightness or dullness of the world, of saying, "This is how I will manage, this is how I will bear it." It is not so different from loving the wrong person. There's even, often, that faint parental disapproval, internalized or explicit, a chorus of reasonable voices insisting that this attachment will end badly, and yet we cannot leave. Not because it always makes us feel good, but because it makes us feel accompanied, embedded. Better, as the saying goes, to be in a relationship with, to have to tolerate some, if not all, of another's quirks and imperfections, than to be completely alone. It's all very Romeo and Juliet, really. It's all extremely juvenile, shamefully so. Bhavesh is a lovely man. I like him a great deal. And he is not alone, having a loving wife, friends and children, a job he really enjoys, but also struggling with his alcohol consumption. Whereas I, well, we know what I am. I am a worm, a nasty little stain on the glorious human tapestry, a cancelling organism made of apology and appetite, dragging itself through the muck of its own making, praying, even as it consumes the earth, to be buried in it, hopefully as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Anyway, here's the experiment, the urge log that we're both doing this week. Each time the wish to drink or vapour rises, faintly, insistently, or with its usual persuasive rhetoric, pause long enough to note 5 things. 1. Time and place. Roughly where and when did the urge appear? Example, 6:30 p.m. kitchen, lunchtime staff room, etc. Number 2. Trigger. Why now? Choose 1 or 2 of these. Habit, stress, boredom, reward, social contact, avoidance, pleasure. 3. Intensity. A scale from 1, a passing thought, to 4, urgent compulsion. 4. Action. Did you drink, delay, or refrain? 5. The feeling 5 minutes later. A few words only. Relieved, calm, restless, unchanged. As I grow older, my father's features appear more insistently in my face. The pouching of the eyes, the downward pull of the mouth, the small sag of flesh that seems to signal resignation more than age. And behind him, if I look closely, there's something older still, the ape from which we descend, that mute ancestor whose face we have stretched and civilized but never fully left behind. I can see this figure very clearly in the eyes, the way they dart and appraise, in the lips that tighten before speech, in the barely perceptible twitch of watchfulness. That which is verging on the tragic is also, of course, a kind of absurd comedy. For the monkey in the mirror looks confused too, by me, by language, by the light, the camera, the endless talking about love and meaning. He is the one who still lives under our skin, carrying our vigilance, our loneliness, our need to be seen. And at the end of each session, with a client, with a patient, when the screen goes dark, he stares back as if wondering when he might finally be allowed to rest. Soon, my friend, soon, you will be in a jute sack, and no more. Soon you will be gone. Planet of the Apes, first Pierre Boulle's 1963 novel, then the 1968 film and its long echo, as surely anyone watching it realizes, it is less about apes per se than about what happens when the mirror of our self-congratulatory human primate exceptionalism shatters. Boulle, who'd already written The Bridge on the River Kwai, was obsessed with the fragility of civilization, how the traits we take as human are mere surface adaptations, reversible with time or circumstance. In the book, the conceit isn't just a kind of evolutionary irony, what if apes became us, but an anthropological nightmare, the slow dawning that intellect, speech, morality, all those badges of superiority are contingent, not essential to the human project. The apes behave with the same bureaucratic cruelty, the same institutional vanity that humans do. Boulle called it a satire, but what it really exposes is the thinness of the membrane between the species. The original film takes that further. Beneath the pulp spectacle, the costumes, the reversed hierarchy, is a vision of cyclical hubris. Charlton Heston's final howl at the ruined Statue of Liberty isn't just about nuclear self-destruction, it's about recognition. He has seen the ape in himself and the human in the ape and realizes that they were never separate. I see this when I catch my own face slacken on the screen as soon as my client has logged off. That collapse of pretense, the glimpse of the ancestral animal still living, tormented and alone, without a tribe, without a god, beneath the modern civilized mask of polite and bright social appeasement and recognition. Is it too early in the year, friend, the middle of October, to be buying panettone? It seems indecent somehow to be doing so already, and yet there it was today in Aldi, stacked high, its specially selected classic panettone, deep midnight blue boxes adorned with peacocks and winter foliage, announcing the season before the trees have finished shedding their leaves. I had only gone in for a few things for dinner, and yet found myself like some obedient acolyte, pausing before the altar of sweet bread. They are still well priced, though perhaps a pound or two dearer than last year, $5.99 now, which feels a small tax on nostalgia. A very good panettone at that, and a lot of it. Too much, perhaps, for one person. I told myself it was indulgent and unnecessary, and that I had put on weight after a slovenly end to the summer, yet here I was, carrying it home anyway, a 750-gram box held awkwardly in both hands because I hadn't brought a bag large enough to conceal my gluttony. 10 minutes into the walk, the box felt much heavier than it had in the shop, as though guilt itself had weight, which had settled into the cardboard. There's something faintly absurd about carrying a soft, perfumed loaf of sweetened bread through the cold October air, the way one might carry a gift meant for someone else, but finding, on inspection, that there's no one left to give it to but one's own fat, foolish self. Yesterday, on a similar whim, I had bought scones or scones, which, come to think of it, share something of the panettone's character, a mild, buttery decadence, the same sultanas and candied orange peel, the same false promise of comfort. I ate 2 of the already stale blobs, unheated, out of impatience, one with butter, one without, both vaguely disappointing. The taste was there, but not the warmth. As usual, I found myself calculating the moral economy of calories, how some foods justify their weight while others don't. An apple, for instance, more than earns its keep. Even good ice cream, in its brevity, seems worth the sin. But a scone, especially one gone cold, unbuttered, unsanctified by tea, feels like wasted effort, a small betrayal of pleasure. I was very pleased to find, when I locked the panettone away, for I am one of those creatures who, if a temptation is not literally under lock and key, will eat more of it than I should, that I happened to have a Tupperware of exactly the right size for it, so that it could sit very neatly now in the treats cupboard, that cupboard of small betrayals, whereafter I deposited the key in my kitchen safe for the next 3 or 4 hours, the ritual complete. I didn't want to keep it in the box, which is cumbersome, needlessly decorative, the kind of Italian theatre that flatters the consumer into feeling festive even before the first slice. The panettone itself, though large, 750 grams of air-reed perfumed softness, is honest about what it is, a pastry confection pretending to be bread, a kind of linguistic as well as other forms of deception there, the illusion of wholesomeness as if the accent mark itself lent nutrition. But it is, of course, a cake, a restrained one, not the sugar-encrusted delirium of the English Christmas kind, but a cake, nonetheless, a measured kind of hedonism. The Tupperware, by contrast, gives it a kind of mildly enforced chastity. It encloses the panettone tightly, seals in the aroma, makes retrieval fractionally more laborious. I like that about it. Temptation ought to be slightly inconvenient, as though desire, if forced to fumble with plastic lids, might lose a little of its urgency. It is reassuring, too, that the panettone now lives within its shell, muffled, unreachable, waiting for a future moment of weakness, that I can at least claim to have postponed. As whiny and inconsequential as yesterday's God voicings were, there was, I admit, a part of me, that small, persistent attention seeker, that, after filing them away, began to fantasize about sending them to Fitzcarraldo, accompanied perhaps by one of those self-effacing but secretly hopeful notes. Dear Fitzcarraldo, thank you for publishing Kiss Kiss Goodbye, something between a parody and a prayer. I could already imagine the YouTube video link attached, my so-called book review, that wasn't really a book review at all, and behind it the childish hope that it might somehow reach beyond the intern who listens for 30 seconds, snorts and deletes. I pictured editor Jacques himself listening for a minute or two, intrigued, maybe even subscribing, passing it on to a friend. That whole ridiculous chain of imagined validation. It's my inner Pessoa, isn't it? That petty bureaucrat of longing, sitting at his desk, excavating the glistening entrails of his own self-regard, holding them to the light and wondering whether anyone else might find them pretty. That kind of vanity is almost endearing when attached to the dead, less so when one catches oneself doing it in real time. In the end, I didn't send it because to do so would have broken the fragile pact I have with this whole enterprise, this speaking to God thing. One cannot address the absolute and then forward that transcript to a publisher saying, look how sincerely I am addressing the absolute. That would be blasphemy of the most obviously human sort. The priest preaching holiness in order to be adored, the self-help guru cultivating enlightenment to fill the front row with damp-eyed believers. There's something nefarious in this, something that curdles even as it shines. I have found myself in recent years composing more and more on the hop, as they say, speaking first, recording rather than writing, because the words seem to arrive faster than the hand can always move across a page, and because when the idea hits, when the so-called God prayer arrives, when the communication swells somewhere in the body, in that strange place where longing and thought become indistinguishable, it feels almost indecent not to let it spill there and then. There is something, I suppose, almost sexual in that impulse, an urge to impregnate the idea into the ear of God, or if we are not being squeamish about blasphemy, into what might equally be called the vagina of God, for if God is everything, then surely God is also this. And men, or at least men of a certain bent, have always been engaged in this confused act of worship, believing, perhaps without knowing it, that the divine ear lies hidden somewhere between the thighs of a woman, as if revelation were a matter of proximity, as if to be understood one only needed to be received. But I will not linger on this pornographic theology, since the God that I address is not so prudish as the censors of YouTube, that modern Saint Peter, the YouTube recommendation algorithm, guarding the gates of attention, denying entry to whatever fails to conform to the rules of engagement. No, what interests me is the scene itself, this playground of voices, this perpetual shouting match we call the internet, where everyone runs amok, possessed by their small, frantic characters, each trying to draw the gaze of an invisible parent, lover, or friend. And perhaps this, too, is what I am doing, what we're all doing, trying to speak into the divine circuitry, into the ear, the wound, the absence, whatever name we give to it. Why address the void, one might ask, when we still wish, hopelessly, to be heard by mortal man and woman, to be touched and answered in kind? Why continue to look up at the sky like the child in the playground shouting at clouds that neither move nor reply? Because this, alas, is the comedy and the torment of the ego, that it must keep calling even when it knows no one is listening, that it must keep inventing gods, lovers, audiences, algorithms, any presence that will make the echo seem less lonely. And if I knew why this was so, if I could explain the secret pleasure of crying out to the nothing that sustains us, I would tell you, I really would. And if I can, one day I will.
It's never easy to say goodbye. And to the faces so rarely do we see another one, so close and so long. With the TV on mute, I'm listening back to the tapes on the hotel bed. My apocalypse. My apocalypse. I realized I had said very little about waves or wheels, or riding for the feeling. Riding for the feeling is the fastest way reach the shore, on water or land. Riding for the feeling, 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 riding for the feeling.